When I heard Unreal could do particle hair, I got pretty excited because I'm terrible at mesh-based hair. So I was really looking forward to creating some particle hair for some characters. I went into Blender and I learned their particle hair setup. I learned how to export it into Unreal and put it in Unreal and all that jazz. And it's not easy, but that pipeline is not very well used. Blender's particle hair setup is intended for renders, not for export. The exporting pipeline is barely implemented, and then of course in Unreal, the grooming setup is still in beta. The groom is the hair groom. So there are quite a few bugs, misfeatures, incompatibilities, things that can just go wrong, and it's very easy to get errors and things you didn't expect that are deeply mystifying. So I figured, let's go through it. Let's go from beginning to end. Let's make a simple little haircut and export it into Unreal and make sure that we understand the pipeline, and we'll cover a lot of tips and tricks along the way. Feel free to add your own tips and tricks below or correct mine if I get anything wrong. And that's it. If you only want to know like one specific thing, like say how to export hair from Blender to Unreal, go look up a video specifically on that. This is going to be just a giant, largely unsorted pile of tips and tricks. First off, this scene that we're in is just a testing scene. It's just got some basic shapes and a default character that I pulled in from Make Human, and then I added in some basic hair testing. With that in mind, I am still getting 60 FPS, even though I have three particle hair systems in this scene on screen at the same time, and some of them have physics. So that's not too bad. We can do multiple characters with particle hair, at least for machines that are of a certain power level, and that's good enough for me. So now the question becomes, how do we actually work with the hair to get it in here? Now, if you're unfamiliar with how Unreal does hair, just so you're aware, it's a special kind of object called a groom, and grooms can be interchanged really, really easily. There we are. So once it's in here, it's really easy to work with. The difficulty is getting it in here in the first place, and that's what we're here to discuss today. Here we are in Blender. If you've ever done any sort of, hair stuff, particle hair stuff in Blender, you already know the basics. You got to grab a scalp. So select some head and then hit Control plus. You don't want any ears. That's going to be the only thing that could bite you. It doesn't matter if you've got too much scalp, that's fine, but the ears have some stuff to them that will get in your way if you're not careful. So once you've selected enough scalp, Shift D to duplicate, P to punch out, and Tab, grab it, and now we've got a scalp. In most tutorials, this is where you'd begin putting particle hair on this scalp, but we're not quite ready for that because the pipeline is very sensitive. So we've got to do some prep work. The first thing we got to do is come over to the modifiers stack and either apply or delete every single modifier. Blender's export does not like modifiers. There are some things that will go wrong if you have certain modifiers attached and you don't happen to click very specific rules in the export. So if your hair has been randomly moving around when you're trying to export it, it's probably because you got modifiers attached. To make matters worse, if you try and apply those modifiers when you're done, Blender will screw up your hair and you'll have to start over. So yeah, that's just a big mess. Don't get into that. Flatten out your modifiers. Give yourself a nice clean mesh. Similarly, we want a nice clean origin point. Having our origin point here is not quite right. What we want is an origin point down here. That's because the mesh, the body mesh we stole it from, has its origin point here. But the armature has its origin point down at 0, 0, 0. So you can hit Control A and apply all transforms, and that should take care of it. If it doesn't take care of it, then you probably got your scalp parented, so you can hit Alt P, deparent it, and then you can apply the transform. Also, flesh-colored hair, kind of gross. Let's switch it over to BSDF hair. You won't be able to use the hair-specific shaders in Blender. They are cycles only, and we won't be using cycles. So we just want some kind of hair color that doesn't blend into the skin. Now we're ready. So let's go into the particle systems and hit plus. And now we've got a particle system. Yeah, well, we're not doing a My Hero Academia character, so let's turn that into hair. One of the things that makes this difficult for newbies is that Blender's defaults are incomprehensible. Why is 4-meter long hair the default? Just bizarre. Also, if you've done tutorials in Blender, you may have found people doing something like this, maybe limiting it to a specific vertex group and then combing it. That might work pretty well if you're planning to render things here in Blender, but we're trying to put this into a game engine and do things live. It can be rather overwhelming to have a lot of extra particles. These are all particles. Each of these is a particle. You have a lot of extra particles underneath the surface where they're invisible, but still have to be calculated. That's not great. So it makes more sense for us to be very careful with the particles we allow onto our scalp. So we're going to add them manually. We're going to zero automatic emission. We're going to create all of our particles ourselves. There are a couple of other things we want to set up. First off, I don't know why, but strand steps is set to 2 by default. This makes no sense. Punch that up to as high as you can set it. You're also going to have to change it somewhere else, because everywhere it's set to a different value. You want to make sure that you turn off show emitter both in the viewport display and in the render display. This is not optional. You must do this or you will not be able to export your hair. Yeah. So now we hit Control Tab, go into particle edit mode, and we can sort of fuss around. This should be pretty close to your default for the comb brush. I don't think I made any significant changes here. Over here you're likely to see something like this, which is just fine for us. And then we go over to add. This is what's going to need work. First off, you want to drop this down to a count of 1 because we're going to add our particles one at a time. Second off, keep your eye on the keys. Keys are just how many control points each strand of hair has, and this can vary in terms of how many you actually want. Some people prefer just 3 or 4, some people prefer like 10, and it also depends on how long the hair is and all sorts of other values. The good news is we can always reduce this inside of Unreal. We can't make it more complicated, but we can reduce the complexity. So don't feel like you have to worry about having too many keys in your hair. That's fine. So in this case, we're going to go to 5, which I believe is the default. And then we're going to add a strand of hair. Boop. Beautiful. So beautiful. We can then go over to the comb and then just comb it. So this is something that if you've ever done any sort of Blender hair before, you already know the basic idea, right? And what if we want the hair to be longer? Well, in that case, we could use this lengthen command, but I prefer to just turn off preserve strand lengths. This gives me a lot of control over the individual control points, and I can set them to be wherever I need them to be, rather than just going along with whatever the default is. Now, if you've never actually seen what control points are in hair, if you're so new that you didn't even realize this view was possible, it's up here. This is the default view. It's completely worthless. You're never going to want to use it. This view is great. It allows us to rearrange these individual particles as we need along their individual anchors. Once we've set that strand up, we can just take a peek at how that looks. Just go back out into object mode and it don't look like much. Well, that's because this is a guide strand. It's not intended to be an actual strand of hair. In fact, it won't render. This is not something that gets rendered. Instead, what we want to render is all of the children. So we can add children by coming over here and going down here. And simple is going to be the thing we're going to want for this kind of hair. That doesn't look simple, though. That looks really chaotic. That's because Blender's defaults are nonsense. There we are. That's more like some hair, right? And we can increase the number of the number we're displaying. We can increase it to maybe 100 for now. What we're planning on doing here is creating a shell of hair. Rather than trying to create the full body of the hair, we only need the impression of the hair. We aren't trying to do full physics sim. We aren't trying to render it for an hour and a half. So our goal here is not to create realistic hair from scalp to tip. Our goal is to create hair that looks decent from the outside. And I can't say I'm an expert on that, but I can say that when you're doing it like this, understanding how many children you have and how that looks is going to be important. If we go back into particle edit mode, we can click here, and that will allow us to see it in here as well. So you can just toggle that on and off whenever you want to check something. Keep in mind, this path steps, for some reason, it is not synced up with this. So you may have to change it in both places, which is really silly, but that's Blender for you. So now let's talk about interpolation. This button here, Interpolate, this is what allows you to create your sheet of hair. Now if we turn that off, then every strand we add is going to stick straight up from the scalp. But if we turn it on, it's going to try and follow the nearest hairs it can find and do the exact same path, see? This is really handy because it allows us to create anchors and then have all of our hair follow those anchors. And that's exactly what we're going to do here. Oop. So now we can fill in the area between them just by clicking, and it'll just automatically fill them. How dense you want to make this really depends on how scruffy your hair is. It's one of those situations where it's okay if you're a little bit too non-dense. If you're not quite dense enough, that's okay, because when we put it in Unreal, we'll be able to amp up the denseness of the hair, which I'll show you when we get to Unreal. So even if it looks like you can see a little bit of scalp through the hair here in Blender, that's okay. And in fact, you're never going to get away from that because the thickness of hair in Blender depends on how close you are to the hair. So no matter what you do, you're always going to be able to see through this scalp if you zoom in. That's just a weirdness of Blender itself, and there's nothing I can do about that. So you're just going to have to learn how to eyeball it and understand how thick that's going to actually be in Unreal, where particle hair thickness actually exists. Now, I don't like this wave that we've got going here. It's not quite right for the style I'm thinking about for our test hair. So what we're going to do is we are going to just adjust this wave using the brush here so that it's more in tune with what I want. One of the things I'm doing when I'm creating this shell of hair, I'm trying to keep our rows of keys all the same. So you can see how it's got the sweep here, the sweep of keys. That just makes it really easy to create a shell of hair if that's what you're aiming to do. Obviously, if your hair is a big mess or something, that might not be a priority. There we are, something like that. Now we can continue to go back, adding more hair as we feel like we should. In this case, we're going to do a very simple haircut. We're not going to try and create anything that goes down the back or anything. We're just going to basically do this. We're almost done. It's worth noting, however, that there are still a lot of bugs to discuss, and that's what we're going to be doing. So one of the things that you might notice is if you are trying to create an X mirrored haircut with a crease down the middle, for example, you're going to have a hard time using Interpolate. Now the reason for that is because Interpolate grabs the closest neighbors it can find without bothering to consider whether or not those neighbors are on the wrong side of the X-axis. So if you are, using a crease, along the center of your head, the interpolation is going to grab hair from the other side of the crease, and it's going to end up creating really weird paths that don't make sense. So that's going to be an issue. There are two ways around it. One way around it is to have big bald spots, and then later on you can move the root of the hair together. If the bald spot is big enough, then you will be able to keep them separated just because they're far apart. Another option is you can do it without mirroring, just do one side, and then you can go up here to the particle system, and basically what happens is, if we go back into object mode here and save it, we can click plus to get a completely new particle system, but we can also duplicate the particle system like this. Now I'm just showing you in this case, it's not really something that we're going to be doing for this particular hair, but if we wanted to, we could tab into the particle edit for this, and we can select all those particles, and we can just like scale X -1, and you can see how they will reverse themselves. This is a pretty easy way to do it. There are some interesting features of this, some misfeatures of this. One of the misfeatures is that this here, all of these values that you have in object mode, where you can, for example, set it to be across the 3D cursor, those all have effect while you're in particle edit mode, even though they don't show up in particle edit mode. So that's something where it's going to be one of the situations where you can figure out a good way to do it if you are paying attention and you're comfortable with Blender. But it's also going to be something where you might find that you're accidentally doing something like this when you don't mean to, and that's because your object mode settings are wrong. Weird stuff, right? One other thing I wanted to mention about having multiple particle systems, one of the things that you're going to run into is trying to decide when to have a new particle system. One reason you might want a new particle system is if you have, this kind of part in your hair and you want that part to be nice and crisp. The easiest way to keep it crisp is to have each side of the part in its own particle system, so that when you do any sort of interpolation, it only interpolates against the part that you're parting currently. Another reason that you might want to have multiple particle systems is to have different particle settings. So for example, let's undo that. For example, we've got particle system and particle system 001. Notice they both have the same settings. This means that if we change these settings in any way, it changes for all of the particle systems that currently use that setting, like so. This can be very handy, but there are lots of times when you'll need different parts of the hair to have different textures. And so you can do that by having each of those particle systems have a different particle setting. You can clone a particle setting just by hitting this button here, but notice that you can't do it right now. The reason for that is because we have an edit applied, and for some reason you are not allowed to change the particle settings while an edit exists. An edit is just the particles, right? So if we delete the edit, now we can change these values, but we can't while we have one. That's really obnoxious because it means that you have to absolutely be sure that you understand whether you want to duplicate a particle setting or not. Do I need this hair to have a new particle setting? You need to know before you actually start to put the hair down. It's also worth keeping in mind that if you are working with multiple particle systems, it will constantly recalculate all of the child hair for all of the particles on every system attached to the object. So while you are working on, your 8th particle system, it might make sense for you to turn off the children, and that will radically increase your frame rate. So if you're noticing that you're really slowing down while you're trying to edit your hair, that might be why. It might be because it's trying to recalculate all of the hair on all of the particle systems for no discernible reason. Now we'll just delete that particle system and turn the hair back on. Now let's talk about lumps. So one of the issues with Blender hair is that it is lumpy. You see this lump? You see how it's got that flat part? And then that little bit of, here you can see it. See that? See that double bump there? How you got that really not circular bump? That's because each of the hair guides that we have is a curve in a classic sense. It's a curve, and these are control points. Like with every curve, the control points have tangent arms. Those are the arms that help you to guide the curve in whatever way you want to. Unfortunately, in particle edit mode, you can't change the tangent directly. So the tangent arms are really big. This means that you're going to end up with tangent arms that end up creating these bumps where the tangent arms influence each other too much. As far as I know, there's no way to reduce the tangent arm size or directly control them. If there is, let me know. But for now, the only way to get rid of that awful double bump setup is to switch over to using different kinds of paths. Rather than using the direct default path, we can switch over to B-spline. The B-spline path will use those anchors as guide anchors rather than as direct flow anchors. This means it ignores any sort of tethers they have, any sort of tangent arms they have, so it will be very, very smooth. The downside of this is that it's also going to be smaller. It's simply not going to go up as far because it's just going vaguely towards the anchor not all the way to it. There is also a bug with B-splines, and this is really infuriating, okay? One of the things that you're going to be doing a lot of is probably interpolating. Interpolating is really important in this sort of setup. So for example, let's go over here to the side of the head, and let's create a hair that we would like to interpolate to have similar hair next to. And you saw how easy it was to interpolate this whole set, right? Well, we want to do the same thing with this hair here. So let's go and let's turn Interpolate back on and try and interpolate. Huh, that doesn't seem right. It keeps getting smaller and smaller and smaller. That's funny. I don't remember having that problem. Oh, it's specifically a problem with the B-splines. So this is obviously just a plain old bug. I don't think it's supposed to be like this. But when you do a B-spline interpolation, with this value turned on, it uses the existing line, the actual hair, as the new place to put the new anchor points, rather than using the old anchor points as the place to put the new anchor points. So it's basically extrapolating based on the softer, smaller hair. So every single time that you try and interpolate again, you're going to get a softer, smaller hair every single time. This is, it's not catastrophic, but it's super annoying. So that means that if you are planning to use interpolation to create a lot of hair, you're going to want to be careful about whether you have B-spline on or off. And you can toggle it on or off all you'd like, but I guarantee you're going to forget which mode you're in. You're going to try and correct the shape of something when you're in the wrong mode. It's just obnoxious, and I hope they fix it at some point because that's very silly. Another fun tip, if you hit L, you can select hair regardless of what mode you're currently in. You don't have to go up into the lasso mode or anything to select the hair. You can just hit L while you're on the hair, and that will select it. And then, of course, you can delete the hair. You can also add and delete individual keys. So, for example, if we come up here to tweak, we could select here, and we could hit Q, or that's my quick favorites. We could go up to particle and hit subdivide. And this will create an additional control point. Similarly, we can hit X and delete the key rather than the particle, and that will get rid of that control point. This can be extremely handy if you're trying to create hair with very specific shapes. Now, with that in mind, I think the only thing we need to do now is create the underhair. In this case, we do need some underhair. It's going to be pretty clear that this is just one layer to anybody that's looking. You see that? So we do need a second layer coming across. However, rather than starting over here somewhere, we're actually going to start in the same place over here. In fact, it might be easiest if we do, in fact, just duplicate that entire particle system. There we are. And we can go into this particle system like so. And we can just turn off root positions and select everything and then move it a little like this and then rotate it. Oh, sorry, I've got the wrong object mode. No, not individual origins. That would be catastrophic. Back into particle edit. Okay, so now we can shrink it, rotate it. Basically, we're just trying to fill in this extra hair here. One of the things you'll notice is that when you're doing this sort of thing, besides the root, all of the hair will kind of hover above the head. So for example, if I were to go G, Z, and pull it down, it's going to end up trying to stay above the scalp if I move it slowly enough, like this, see? So what that is the comb's deflect emitter setting is trying to remain above the emitter. This is the emitter, the scalp. You can adjust that if you want. I've seen some people that try and turn it off or, similarly work with it. There's a problem with that though. This setting is not only grumpy, it is also applied in every single every single mode that you're in. It's gonna happen. So while you're moving, while you're, lengthening, cutting, anything you do, this setting is going to be it's going to be used. Even though these other modes don't show that setting is still going to be in effect, just like the object mode settings that we were discussing before. And it's going to constantly get reapplied anytime you toggle it. So for example, If we were to turn deflect emitter off and then pull this front hair down into the scalp, like so, that's something that can only happen while deflect emitter is turned off. If we were then to unselect everything and just select one hair, like this one random hair back here, and we're like, I want to edit that one hair, but I do want to turn the deflect emitter back on. So let's do that, and let's edit. Did you see how it just edited all of the hair? Pushed it all back above the scalp? That's going to be a never-ending problem for you if you are fussing with deflect emitter. So my recommendation is leave deflect emitter on at all times. Now, if you have some experience with this kind of hair, you might currently be thinking, wait, that doesn't work because the emitter is super bad. It like gets in your way a huge amount, right? So for example, hold on, just let me adjust this hair a little bit here. For example, if we were to add another piece of hair here, let's go ahead and put it right down here. Oh, sorry. Come on. There we are. If we were to add this piece of hair and we were to comb it, forward. Oh, sorry, I grabbed all of the hair besides the one I was trying to do. Try to comb it forward over the face, like to get in front of the face. It won't comb. It like won't go where it's supposed to go. See that? It just won't do what it's supposed to do. And this can be a really significant problem. There are plenty of times where this has actively got in my way and I've been like, why can't I move this hair? Because it's trying to deflect from the emitter, but there's no emitter down here. What's it deflecting from? The answer to that is the emitter has an open face. It's just a scalp. So if we look at it internally, we've got this big open area down here and where the rest of the head would be. Deflect emitter tries to take that place into account, and it creates like a deflector shadow outwards from that hole. And I think it does that just by projecting directly out from these faces here. The good news is, if that is bothering you, there is a super easy fix. Just select a center point like this one, and then hit F a whole bunch. There you go. That will make it so that the deflector emitter only deflects from the one emitter that you're currently actually using, rather than trying to estimate where other emitters might be. Sorry, I just selected the wrong object. Let's try that again. So now that I've done that, this can be put inside the skull, because the face doesn't count as the emitter. The only reason I couldn't get it into the face before is because it was creating this imaginary halo of places I wasn't allowed to go. And I've told it, don't have any imagination, just do the scalp. And that means that I can now push things down into the face if I have to. And it's pretty straightforward. You can also build more emitter down into the face if you really want to have a more nuanced setup, because since we're adding our particles one by one directly, we don't have to worry about if we have extra stuff, extra mesh for our emitters. We could actually use the whole body as an emitter if we wanted to. It would be fine. Anyway, let's delete this and delete that. So as you can see, we have two layers of hair, but they're really obvious. You see how it's very clearly exactly two layers of hair. We can do a lot to adjust that. If we come down here into the settings, there are so many settings that we can use to change exactly how our hair falls. One of the things we can do is we can set up a series of clumping weights. So you can clump like this, but I always like to use the clump curve instead. It just gives you more control. With the clump curve, we could set it up to be tight at the tip. So, here, see how tight that becomes? And then loose at the end. Or we could do it kind of tight at both ends and loose in the middle. We can set it up however we want. This is also super helpful if you're planning to tuck things behind the ear, because you can create a system setting for the particles that is specifically going to clump right as it passes across the ear. Nice and handy. In this case, what we want is we want this to be really wide open at the end to get us a little bit more body there. And we'll come back up to the top We said that this was going to be emitted, here it is, every 0.01 meters. That draws a circle around your control hair, 0.01 meters around, and it creates all of the child hair within that circle. So if we were to increase that to 0.02, for example, you can see how much fuzzier everything gets because there's just a lot more radius that we're drawing from. But the clumping interacts with that. So we can clump down to whatever thickness we actually want without having to worry about that. See? So now we've got a really fuzzy endpoint. If we want to continue to polish this, we can just make it so that these endpoints go up and down. So that instead of being a straight line like we have here, we'll just go into our vertex edit mode. By the way, you can hit W to switch between select modes, which is super handy, but I find that I don't actually need my select modes very much. I'll just select every other hair strand and bring it down. Oh, I want to turn off strand length preservation or else the whole hair will vibrate. And if we switch over to the other particle system, we can just do the opposite. That's a little bit better. Not great, but still better. So you can see how we can create hair like this. And at this point, it looks like she's got hair plugs because we've got it so tight. We can just, make it a little bit looser, however we want to make it. Now you can spend an eternity making hair, and we didn't make the best hair possible because we don't have that kind of time. I don't want to spend that kind of time wasting your time. But I wanted to make sure that you understood some of the basics, what a B-spline does, what some of the common errors are in setting this up, and that you're probably going to want to focus on creating sheets of hair. Let's go ahead and export this. So to export it, make sure you have just your hair selected. That's all you need. You don't need any other hair or any other objects, and you need to have exactly this much selected. Then you go up to File, Export, and then you scroll up a couple more notches to the Save button, and you click that, because this will crash. Then you can go down to Export, and we're using the Alembic export. You're probably familiar with this if you've ever, worked with this pipeline before. And we can go ahead and call this, I don't know, Pop Top. However, we have to make sure that our settings are correct. We need the scale to be 100. We need it to only use the selected and visible objects. And we probably want to set it for viewport settings. If any of these values are wrong, you're going to run into trouble. And they reset every time you open Blender. So I guarantee you're going to get it wrong because you're going to forget that you have to keep setting them. The basic problem here is that if the Alembic file contains even one actual vertex, Unreal will assume that it is a mesh animation rather than a groom, hair. So you have to make sure that no meshes get exported. That means you can't have anything else selected, and the mesh that's part of your particle system, the scalp itself, has to be invisible. And then we can just hit export. How long this takes will depend on how much hair you've got and how complex the hair is, but not in the way you might think. I have had hair like this. See how long this is taking? Not very fast, right? And yet, the big, long, spirally hair thing that I put into that scene earlier, that took like 5 seconds to export. And we're going to talk about that when we hit in Unreal, because that is actually important. We'll talk about exactly why in a moment here. All right, we've exported. Pop over to Unreal, and you should see this. If you do not see groom import options, there are two possibilities. One possibility is that you forgot to turn the plugin on. There is a specific plugin for Alembic groom imports. You've already got the plugin. You just have to turn it on. That's under Edit Plugins. The other thing you need to do is make sure that you didn't include any meshes. So if you've got the plugin turned on and it still tries to import it as a mesh rather than a groom, you probably flubbed the export. Now you notice there are some weird numbers here. That's because Alembic's axes are all screwed up. I don't know why. So you have to remember to rotate it by 270 on the x-axis or -90, your choice, and multiply it by -1 on the z-axis. Otherwise, you're not going to have the right setup, and you're going to have to manually adjust the hair, which isn't going to work very well with some of the more automated systems that you might be using. So import it. And then we can go down and take a peek. Hair, pop top. There it is. So obviously this is not exactly the world's most complex hair, but it is good enough for our demonstration purposes. So this is what it looks like, and you can see that we can see through it. Well, what does that look like in the scene? Good news, it's super easy to switch out these grooms. You just click on them and switch them out. There we are. Now I got a different groom. If we take a look at this, it's not that bad. Once the scalp is behind it, we can't see through it nearly so clearly. However, if we do think that this is still a little bit too threadbare for us, it's easy to modify. So we can go back into that hair, and we can change some of these settings values. All of these tabs are settings, and there's more besides. There's so many things you can do here. What we're going to want to do is change the hair width to maybe 0.03. That will just thicken up the hair. With that hair width thicker, we have a much denser hair. Now, this is a little bit less realistic, but if you're trying to preserve your frames per second, you're probably going to have to do this. You don't want to have a kabajillion strands with a kabajillion verts each. And the easiest way to avoid that is to just make each strand more important. We can also keep looking around here. We're going to want to take a look at the actual curves we're using. This is on the first tab, the actual import. You can see we've got 4,800 curves with 4,900,000 verts. Each one of our strands has 100 verts. Why? Why did Blender choose to export this hair with 100 verts per strand? I do not know. How many verts Blender uses seems to be random. I've had hair that uses almost the ideal amount, and I've had hair that uses 100. So what we're going to do is we're going to decimate our verts down to maybe 0.05. And this is going to take a little bit of time to calculate, just so you're aware. The idea is you want to get that number down because that number will kill your frame rate. That is something that you do want to just optimize the instant you import it. The curves that are being exported from Blender are not optimized for use in Unreal. They're optimized for use in a rendering, render this one frame for the next 10 hours. And that's not what we need. So we do need to take some actions to make sure that that works. Now you can see that there was some difference in terms of exactly which hair moved where, and you can rewind and pop it back and forth. But this is still perfectly acceptable, and we've cut the number of verts down to 250 instead of, what was it, 5 million? Yeah, this is definitely better. So that's going to be much nicer when it comes to the frame rate requirements that we're getting out of it. So yeah, we're still hitting at 60, more or less. So you can work with that to create whatever sort of hair you want. You can also turn on the physics sim, do whatever you want to do with that sort of stuff. Let's briefly cover materials. So if we take a look at the hair, it's using this material called dyed hair, and I've got several, right? If we pop that up, it looks like this. So let's go over what we're doing here just so that you understand the basics of creating a hair material. The most critical thing about this is you're going to want to change the shading model to hair. This is specifically for particle hair. But you also have to set it up to use with hair strands. If you don't tick this box, then you can set it up properly and it'll render properly in edit mode. But the instant you hit play, it will revert back to the default hair material. So make sure that that's ticked. You're also going to want to make sure that you are using hair attributes, especially for the tangent. Hair attributes will allow us to pipe in data about the hair. And roughness, specular, and scatter are things that you can work out on your own as you prefer. In general, a higher scatter is for brighter hair. Over here, I'm using a pretty basic setup. Because this is for dyed hair, what I'm doing is I am trying to figure out where along the hair I want to create the dye line. So you can see how her hair is got some roots showing, quite a lot of roots showing, and I was doing that just to demonstrate, right? So if I wanted to change where those were, I can simply change how much of that is being displayed. Yep, come on. Yep. With this tip dye position. And then, of course, then I can blend between the two hair colors based on that. Which hair attribute you use is going to take some practice. There's a lot of things you can do here. For example, originally I used length, but that ended up being the number of centimeters along the hair, which wasn't quite what I wanted, because that meant that if I was trying to do the tips, it would only get the tips of the very longest strands of hair. Whereas if I use U, that's the UV map along the length axis, and every single strand of hair starts at 0 and goes to 1, so it was much easier to work with. And then over here what I do is I just screen blend towards a brighter color depending on the seed, which as far as I know, is basically just a random value. I actually don't know whether it's between 0 and 1 or what. It's hard to find out information on it, but this seemed to work. And in the end, it came out with hair that looks not too shabby for what I need it to be. And over here you can see a version that's kind of brown rather than pink. There are a lot of other things we could talk about when it comes to getting this pipeline to work, but I really wanted to cover some of the things that bit me. The things that were worst for me were remembering that I had to apply all of the modifiers on the scalp. That was a truly mystifying thing, because when I hit export, Blender would literally randomly move my hair around. Like I would watch it in real time move my hair around. I thought I was having a stroke. That was really bizarre, but it's just the modifiers. I also wanted to make sure that we understood that you have to make sure it's just the hair. You hide all of the other meshes. We also need to make sure to decimate the hair once it's in Unreal, and we can thicken the hair. Keep in mind that you can also decimate the hair strands themselves. So if you have put too many hair strands in an effort to be realistic, you can always decimate those as well. Unreal can't create more hair, but it can reduce the amount of hair you currently have. And that's going to be super handy when it comes to optimizing your hair. Oh yeah, and make sure that you tick all the boxes you need to tick when you're creating hair materials. I think that's everything I wanted to cover. Yeah, feel free to share your own tips below.